National corporate funding for Frontline is provided by NPR.
In Denver,
Skopje,
in Tehran,
Omaha,
in Istanbul, in Hong Kong,
Belgrade,
in Decatur,
in Seattle,
Beijing,
in Pittsburgh,
in Johannesburg.
This is NPR News.
And by Earthlink. Major funding for this program is provided by the Annenberg Foundation, with additional funding from the Pew Charitable Trusts, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.
Early this year, President George W. Bush signed into law the most sweeping reform of public education in 40 years.
The fundamental principle of this bill is that every child can learn. We expect every child to learn, and you must show us whether or not every child is learning.
With near unanimous support in Congress, the president pushed through the main element of his plan: more tests. The law now calls for testing students in every state, every year, from the 3rd through the 8th grades. Many schools have already embraced the new accountability, but some complain they've been reduced to teaching to the test.
It's more important that children do well on a test than they do well in my class. My grade doesn't matter. My comments don't matter. My teaching doesn't matter. It's just this one test.
And test writers themselves have doubts.
I want to know whether or not a student asks questions, whether they're part of a conversation. I can't measure that with a test.
The public in general has bought into the idea that these tests reflect how good schools are. It is simply incorrect.
Tonight, Frontline and PBS education reporter John Merrow look at how the new tests and standards are remaking public education in America.
To show everyone here that Dumbarton Elementary School has more school spirit, we're going to turn on some championship music, some celebratory music. Boys and girls, your parents probably haven't seen school spirit like this before, so you help them cheer too. When a team wins the Super Bowl.
In a public elementary school in Henrico County, Virginia, a celebration is about to begin.
Boys and girls, raise your hand if you know all about school spirit. If you know about team spirit, school spirit. Okay, now here's where we need your help.
It's not for homecoming.
We want you to start cheering.
Or sports.
We want you to cheer so loud.
Or graduation.
That we'll see that roof reverberate a little bit back and forth.
This is a celebration over test scores. The teachers at Dumbarton Elementary have crossed an important threshold. For the first time, students here passed Virginia's state test. As a result, this school, once rated near the bottom, has moved all the way to the top. Outside, a new flag is raised to mark the achievement. Bearing the stamp of approval, full accreditation from the state of Virginia. In an effort to improve education, Virginia made passing its test a requirement. Schools that fail may be closed. Nearby is a school that hasn't passed, Baker Elementary. And here the pressure is on to improve the scores.
School starts the minute that bus pulls onto the driveway or it pulls onto the property.
Kay Thomas is principal.
Good morning, boys and girls.
Good morning, Miss Thomas.
Boys and girls, why'd you come to school today?
To learn.
Okay, that means everybody's ready to go.
Baker Elementary is determined to pass the test and keep its doors open.
Morning.
I want to reach full accreditation more than anything I want in the world. One of the teachers said the other day, Kay, if I offered you $1 million or full accreditation, which one would you take? And I said, full accreditation. And I truly mean that.
The students at Baker will be tested on a new state curriculum. Everything Virginia students are expected to know and everything their teachers are required to teach is described in the state's academic standards called the Standards of Learning, or SOLs. In every subject and in every grade, the SOLs spell out exactly what should be taught and what should be tested.
The SOLs are my curriculum. They tell me exactly what I'm going to teach. They're specific to exactly what I do every day, all day long.
Why do you think they did that?
It gives me a guideline for what I need to teach, and that's something that I really like. I don't have to go out and say, well, you know, I'm teaching famous Americans. The SOLs tell me exactly what third grade famous Americans I need to teach, what second grade, first grade, and kindergarten famous Americans I need to go back and review to make sure they've retained that information.
All right, you may begin.
To prepare for the state test, Baker Elementary does a lot of testing of its own. Groups of students begin the day with 10-minute speed tests.
I want number 2.
Computers run students through drills.
Please put your finger on 20.
And teachers are required to give weekly exams. Some of the testing helps track students' progress. Some of it is simply practice for the state's multiple choice test.
What we try to do in first grade is give them all types of assessments so that whatever they get on a test is not going to freeze them up. They're going to really be able to do give the information that they know.
The kids are given the exact look of the test. I mean, we don't want there to be any unfamiliars that will, detract from the accuracy of the scores.
Latifundia. Does anyone remember what that is? Everyone underline latifundia. That's another word we need to know. Brett.
Down the road at Verina High School, the focus is also on testing. And here, too, they've had to adopt the state's uniform curriculum.
Bottom line is results. We throw together a good product, and I think that the kids can sense the difference between a teacher who's showing up to really prepare them and a teacher who's not.
We need to understand that if the public tax dollars are paying our salaries and providing the resources, we need to understand that there should be a result.
For Henrico County School Superintendent Mark Edwards, results are the bottom line.
High-performance organizations set goals and work hard to reach those goals. And I think that it's about goal setting and really paying careful attention to learning.
Edwards pays close attention to test scores. He's running the schools with a business-like approach.
In any organization, whether it's a business analogy or sports, you hire people and you give them the support and you say, this is the job that needs to be done. But if the job isn't done after a period of time, say, we've got to find somebody else that can get that job done. There's a clarion message to all. We must be accountable.
But in some places, enormous hurdles stand in the way of passing the state's mandatory test. Across the county line, in the neighboring district of Richmond, virtually all the schools are struggling. Just 5 of the 54 schools here have passed the state test.
Spell get.
Get. G-O-T.
Test scores at Lola McDowell School are stuck at the bottom.
Passing those tests is the last thing on their mind. They're worried about whether they're going to have food on their plate, whether they're going to have a home to go to after school, whether somebody's going to be shooting a gun in front of their house, drugs, whether they're going to be abused.
Her kindergartners, she says, are behind from day one.
Many of our children are coming to school in kindergarten for the very first time. They have no idea of how to hold a pencil. They have just gotten out of their mother's laps, per se. Some of them don't know how to use the restroom. Some of them are not able to use utensils correctly.
There's no books in the house. Or if there are books in the house, they are not given to the children and said, no, turn the TV off, do this, do that. Our kids have, right back to the start, no vocabulary. They haven't been exposed to certain things.
Many of Karen Merriman's high school students are also behind.
I had kids coming to school that were living in cars. I had kids coming to school to eat. And when you've got a 13-year-old kid or a 14-year-old kid dealing with something that you and I would have a hard time dealing with, and then we pompously hand them these SOLs and say, this is what you have to do to get out of school. It seems a little ridiculous at times.
I'm not trying to teach young people to feel good about living in the projects. I'm trying to teach them to do things that will get them out of the projects.
Bill Bosher was one of the main architects of Virginia's school reforms.
The kindest thing I could do was put a little more on, not so much to break, but a little more on that will help them to gain the skills that will advance them, not just accommodate them. We do a disservice to young people who've been falling through the cracks by not holding them to the same standards. It's maybe their only hope to be caught.
What's this word?
Spring.
Spring. Arise. I am not against standards. We've had standards all along. I'm not against assessment.
What are you against?
I am against the pressure and the stress that is put on us for getting children to master these SOLs at the same rate of speed, when everyone knows that all children do not learn the same way or at the same rate.
But back at Baker Elementary, a school that also serves many disadvantaged children, things are looking better. 3 years ago, test scores here were at the bottom. They've climbed steadily. Now passing scores are within sight, and so is the test, just a few weeks away.
If I'm nervous, the kids can sense it, so I try to hide it. We try to keep them pumped up. We try to keep them motivated. We do a lot of fun things before we get our day started. One of the things we do is we huddle, and somebody gives us a cheer.
We can do it, we can do it, we can bust this test. We can do it, we can do it, we can bust this test. Go Tigers!
All right. It's just something that puts a smile on their face before they get started in the morning. But I get nervous. It's the big game. It's just like going to the big game. You get very nervous about it.
What does that mean? You wake up in the morning?
And wake up in the morning, it's Super Bowl time. You know, we're taking the math test today. How are they going to score? Are we going to win the game?
Around the country, in all 50 states, bottom-line reforms like Virginia's are transforming public schools. Often controversial, they've now moved to the top of the national agenda.
And now we take you live to the East Room of the White House, where President Bush will unveil his education plan.
Mandatory testing is the centerpiece of George W. Bush's education agenda.
Children must be tested every year, not just in the 3rd grade or the 8th grade, but in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th and 8th grade. How's your teacher? Pretty cool?
Yeah.
Bush campaigned as an education reformer. As president, he pledged to make schools show results.
I'm an activist for high standards. I'm an activist for accountability. My administration has set a great goal. We will lift the load of low expectations so that all children will rise.
Not everyone agrees with the president's plan.
I don't think that the public is clear enough in the costs of saying we're going to measure everything on test scores.
Ted Sizer is a leader in education reform with serious doubts about more and more mandatory testing.
At the worst, these standardized tests provoke a kind of drilling mentality. It's a game. And so you learn, you have people who you can pay to teach you how to figure the test out, not the substance, the test. So what you're teaching is a kind of cynicism, which is, you get a high test score, this is what you got to do. And the message for life is, you want to get ahead in life, this is the way you jiggle the system. And that's pernicious.
Why is that such a strong defense of the status quo?
when the status quo is failing us.
To fight for his testing plan, Bush brought an ally from Texas, Rod Page, the former superintendent of schools in Houston.
Why has it taken us so long to say, hey, we need standards? Let's think about that for just a minute. We're saying that in schools we should have standards. And that turns out to be a controversial discussion. Would that be the case in the hospital district or in the public highways or in the building industry? Everybody else takes standards as the ordinary, and we're taking standards as something that is extraordinary. I think that gives you some clue on how much we need to change.
The argument for change was first made almost 20 years ago by another Texan, billionaire Ross Perot.
You can spend any amount of money you want to on this school system, and unless you manage it and control it intelligently, you will not get results.
When Perot spoke, politicians listened. Soon, Texas became one of the first states in the nation to put in place a high-stakes test called the TOS.
You guys really do know this stuff. I want you to be confident in yourselves. We're about to pass out the answer booklets.
Schools and teachers were now under pressure to produce results every year.
All right, you guys ready? Yeah. Wait, let's try that again. You guys ready? Yeah. You guys ready? Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Scores went up in Texas, especially among Black and Hispanic students. But critics charged that students who could not pass the test dropped out of school in higher numbers, and there were reports of widespread cheating. But around the country, dissatisfaction with public schools was on the rise, and momentum for testing continued.
Would you please take your seats? Let me begin by saying good afternoon to all the governors.
Business leaders held a summit with the nation's governors to push for reform. Louis V. Gerstner Jr. of IBM led the way.
It's time to set standards and then go achieve them. We never will know whether anything gets fixed in public education until we establish a system that says, here's what children should learn, here's what they should be able to do when they graduate, and let's measure their success.
Testing caught on. By 1999, every state had embraced a business-like approach to schooling, a fundamental change in American public education. For some educators, these changes just raised more questions.
Did you want a small group of people deciding the ideas that are going into your children's head? People you can't get at? People who say there's one answer? There's an arrogance to this, which has been costly.
But pressure to fix public schools overrode concerns about too much testing. Politicians around the country embraced it.
The action statement is adopted. I thank you.
I think we've educated almost a generation and a half of people who have very, very poor prospects. And that's awful.
Nowhere was the problem greater than in California, with the nation's largest public school system. Back in the mid-1990s, California's schools hit bottom.
California finished in 1995 tied with Louisiana for last in reading. We were behind Mississippi in the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The California politics was that there was a crisis here.
California schools must be places of high test scores and even higher aspirations.
Pete Wilson was then California's governor. He called for tougher academics and mandatory testing.
I think politicians are responding to a democratic impulse and demand and polls of the people saying, kindergarten through 12 education is really messed up in California. You've got to fix it fast.
Within a year, California had new academic standards in place. But creating its own test would take much longer.
So California said, Well, we have these content standards over here on what ought to be in the curriculum, but we got to grab a test off the shelf right away and test the kids, even if it doesn't match the content standards, and it didn't.
Okay, so here we are. We're ready to take another test.
The test in California is called the Stanford 9 or SAT-9. It's a widely used, commercially sold national achievement test. Scores on the SAT-9 are used to publicly rate schools.
The public in general has bought into the idea that these tests reflect how good schools are. It is simply incorrect.
James Popham, a test writer and professor emeritus at UCLA, says the first problem with off-the-shelf tests like the SAT-9 is that they are written to be sold all over the country.
The testing companies are in the business of making money, and they're going to create whatever kind of test seems most acceptable to most people. And as a consequence, the gaps between what is on a test and what is actually taught sometimes are profound.
At Logan High School near San Francisco, students who recently took the SAT-9 found questions about topics their teachers had not yet taught.
The test is 1 year ahead of the curriculum. When you're a freshman, you take the World Studies test before you even take the course. As a sophomore, you take the American history test before you even take the course. And as a junior, you take American political system and economics on the test before you even take the course. So basically, you're taking a test on stuff you don't even know yet.
Different teachers teach different things, and they teach you different ways to, attack problems. And a lot of the problems on there we hadn't learned how to do.
One question I really didn't get was that it told me to compare the economic and government systems of New Zealand and basically Great Britain, and we haven't really gone in depth into political and economic systems. We're really dealing with U.S. history, so I really could not answer the questions to my best ability because I hadn't taken the course yet.
It costs roughly $6 per student to administer tests like the SAT-9, which is entirely multiple choice.
The reason we tend to go first to a multiple choice is practical. I can measure a lot of things very efficiently, very quickly, and fairly cheap.
Audrey Qualls is co-author of the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, another widely used achievement test. She believes the public reads too much into test scores.
It's not an accurate indication of how good the schools are or how well they're performing. That in and of itself isn't enough. I want to know whether or not a student asks questions, whether they're part of a conversation, whether they use background information, caring about learning. I can't measure that with a test.
Especially if it's the wrong kind of test. SAT-9 is built to rank students, like the 9th graders in Judy Hirsch's class.
7x plus?
Some at the top,
awesome, right?
some at the bottom, most in the middle.
If I'm a good teacher and I'm teaching well and my students are good learners and they're learning well, then they might actually learn the material that I'm teaching them. Well, then they would do better on the test. Well, then they would pull those questions.
By removing questions that most students get right, test writers can produce scores in a bell-shaped curve with a ranking for every student. But some say it's unfair to judge schools with this kind of test.
Well, the test is basically saying, we don't want you to pass. That's what it's saying.
Once a lot of pupils know a question, you've got to get rid of it because it doesn't spread the curve.
That's one of the reasons why those of us who are opposed to the test are so opposed to the test. It actually doesn't test if you're teaching and learning. It tests what you come to school with. So it's really based on your socioeconomic level. It filters out anything a teacher teaches during the school year.
We have no choice. It's like when you play in a crooked game when it's the only game in town. SAT-9 right now is the only game in town for us.
For California teachers like Stephen Weinberg, it's a game with high stakes.
We're in a situation here where we're under the gun in terms of our SAT-9 scores. Our principal has been notified that he is on probation based on our improving our scores. So no one here takes lightly the SAT-9.
Weinberg was hired by Frick Middle School in Oakland to figure out a way to get scores up. But in analyzing past results, he noticed a disturbing trend.
Okay, well, if you look down on a single class here, you'll notice the wide swings in scores.
Up
7-point
7,
gain.
up 12, up 46.
Yeah, here's a student that supposedly gained 46th percentile.
Here's one up 31.
Mm-hmm. Here's another page, a student just up 22, another student in the same class down 32.
Here's a kid who went up 50 points, down 24.
points.
I mean, that's astounding.
Yeah. So these clearly are not reliable statistics. The test shows a student down at the first percentile one year and at the 51st percentile the next, or the 51st percentile one year and down to the first percentile the next. A student couldn't lose that much ability in 1 year. It's impossible, except if there were a brain injury or something.
A more plausible explanation comes from students themselves.
The majority of the school does not care and does not understand why we take these tests.
They didn't take it seriously and they didn't care because they know that even if they do poorly on these tests, nothing bad is going to happen to them.
A lot of students took it as like a free week, you know, to goof off.
Please pass these back very carefully.
But for teachers and schools, the test is serious business. Low scores on the SAT-9 can lead to penalties. High scores to rewards.
I would like to introduce our governor to all of you, the Honorable Gray Davis.
I'm very pleased to announce that today we're going to grant almost $47,000 to Disney Elementary, so give yourself a big hand.
Under Governor Gray Davis, California handed out a total of $834 million in cash bonuses to schools and teachers, all based on SAT-9 scores.
It's really sad that most educational policymakers are well-intentioned and install accountability measures involving these kinds of tests in the belief that good things will happen to children. But most of these policymakers are dirt ignorant regarding what these tests should and should not be used for. And the tragedy is that they set up a system in which the primary indicator of educational quality is simply wrong.
California is changing. A custom-made test it began developing several years ago is now coming online. It's designed to measure what California students are actually being taught. In Massachusetts, they tried to do testing right from the very start. But this is not as easy as it sounds.
You don't want a kid to get nailed by a question. The kid, again, it's a question that kid could have a lot of knowledge and now get it wrong because he didn't know that name. That's the kind of question I don't think is a good idea.
Massachusetts calls its test MCAS. It begins here, with committees of teachers choosing the questions for the state test from lists supplied by test writers. This is the part of testing that's rarely seen.
All right, we know we need to have 10 questions that deal with Africa. So let us look from 100 of them and we'll pick the 10.
If we say this and we go down this line where we say how many questions you're going to have on Africa, how many questions you're going to have on Asia, how many questions you're going to have on Europe, how many questions you're going to have on this.
No, that's not how many questions on the test. This is just we want a bunch of questions to look at.
Intellectually, I don't think that's necessary.
Well, it is, given the fact that today and yesterday, the questions that we have looked at, we have one on Japan, we have one on Africa, and everything else is European. I'm sorry. I mean, by not doing this, okay, we're not focusing in on other areas that we are telling teachers they need to teach.
We were actually dissatisfied as a group with the items we were seeing. So actually, you saw us arguing a bit about saying to the testing company, you need to give us more questions that we can look at, not one at a time, but in fact, more questions around a theme or an area of the world or a big idea.
Yeah. Like the Islamic influence on Africa, the development of Timbuktu,
So
the gold salt trade, I mean, there's a million things.
We don't want 100 questions on Africa if they're all trivial pursuit
Right,
questions.
that's right.
Exactly.
If I can only pick one item, please let's make sure it's the best item we can have.
Let's draw up a chart and a map.
That would be very helpful.
Dissatisfied with the questions, these teachers sent the test writers back to work. Committees like this screen hundreds of questions, weeding out the ones that are vague or poorly worded, or that do not relate to what's taught in schools.
So they have to be directly related. There were a couple that we looked at, and again, we went back and went through the standards and frameworks and said this is not in here. Specifically, we cannot ask that question. It wouldn't be fair to the teachers or students, and we have eliminated those questions.
Massachusetts has not cut corners on testing. It develops its own test built to measure what's taught in school, and it's not all multiple choice.
I think one of the good features of our test, one of the reasons we believe it is a good test, is because it requires students to do a fairly significant amount of writing.
Jeff Nellhouse is Massachusetts Director of Testing.
We have some multiple choice questions. There are things that can be tested very well and efficiently with multiple choice questions. But what we call the open response or constructed response questions require students to write out an answer. We have one shot here to get at the very central things we want to assess, and we don't want to assess things that are trivial or arcane.
And the scores are going to count heavily for students, not just for schools. If students here cannot pass the test, they will not graduate from high school. In nearly half the states around the country, those will be the new rules.
The catalyst was the business community. They stepped forward and said, look, these kids are graduating without skills. And we refuse, or I refuse, to stand by and watch kids given a false diploma, which is what's been happening.
David Driscoll is Massachusetts Commissioner of Education. He's been a supporter of the graduation test since the idea emerged in the early 1990s.
Have you taken the test?
Yes.
How'd you do?
Well, I didn't score myself, but I would have passed. I literally take it simply because I like the experience of going through it. I find it to be a very valid test.
But it's the high-stakes graduation requirement that makes MCAS so controversial. And the question at the center of the controversy is this: should one test determine the outcome of 12 years of schooling, decide who gets a diploma and who gets nothing?
It's bad practice. We don't need tests. We don't need these tests to tell us who's having a hard time and who's in trouble in school. We basically know the answer to that. You can ask any classroom teacher and they can tell you to a fairly well who the kids are that are having trouble in math, reading, you name the subject.
George Madaus is a testing expert at Boston College.
We know that certain populations are poorly served, that there are schools that aren't doing a good job for kids. We know that. But now we've added this test as a documentary of those problems that we've known for years exist. And you're not going to test your way out of those problems.
We're trying to correct a wrong, a historic wrong, that in this Commonwealth means that 667,000 young people have been given a false diploma. That's got to stop. And so we're just simply trying to set a standard that says, look, this is what you need to do.
MCAS is supposed to tell us which students know enough to graduate, and Massachusetts is spending $20 million a year to develop its custom-made tests. But the tests turn out to have mistakes. This question appeared on the most recent 10th grade math test. Which of the following shapes cannot be made by combining equilateral triangles? A trapezoid, a rhombus, a hexagon, or a pentagon?
And you can actually make all those shapes, and that was the problem, because you had to find out which one you couldn't make.
Pete Peterson, a 10th grade student, discovered the mistake. During the test, he spent precious minutes puzzling over the question. He passed, but confusion may have brought his score down and hurt other students too.
If you take a lot of time on one problem, you're going to be tired for the rest of the test. I know a lot of people have taken a lot of time for the problem because they knew there was a way to make the pentagon. Like some of the people that actually wanted to take the test because they knew they had to do it to pass, and so they decided that they were going to take the time to try to figure out the problem, and they couldn't.
That test had been screened. People didn't see that you could make a pentagon.
Bill Kendall is Pete's math advisor.
Pete's showing us there's a real flaw in just standardized multiple choice tests. There's whole types of intelligence that you're not measuring. And in fact, being intelligent and tenacious, as Pete was, can hurt you. Who would you rather hire in a position? Do you want someone who can whip through a multiple choice test fast and bubble in the correct answers? Or do you want someone, as Pete showed, who's tenacious with problems and who can come up with unusual, creative solutions?
MCAS may not always identify the most creative problem solvers, but can it at least tell us whether students know enough to graduate?
I remember my leg was shaking. My knee tends to shake when I get nervous, and I was thinking I have to calm down. And while I was thinking that, time was flying by.
When Madeline Valera was a 10th grade student at Boston Arts Academy, everyone had to take the math portion of MCAS. Even though the test results would not count for graduation until the next year, she was nervous.
It's dreadful. Anything that you might have studied, definitely you forget it at that moment. At least for me, I totally blank out when I'm nervous.
Madeline failed. She needed a 220 to pass. She got a 216. But how precise is her score? Can the number be trusted?
When I first started teaching, I believed in the accuracy of numbers. And many parents still do. They believe that those numbers are so darn precise. Psychometricians, experts in testing, have a term they call the standard error of measurement, which indicates how likely it is the kid's score will be off by a certain amount every time the kid takes a test. It's a lot. These tests are not as precise as is widely believed.
The public may believe that test scores are always accurate and precise, but test scores are much like political polls. They too contain a margin of error.
When you're setting a cut score, and if I'm 1 point below a cut score, and I have a standard error of measurement that's plus or minus 3 points, it's very likely that my true ability is above the cut. And if you have absolutely no knowledge of what a standard error means, you're going to assume you have perfect measurement and fail the student. It's a problem.
Could it have been a problem for Madeline Valera? The margin of error on the test she took is plus or minus 6 points. What could that 216 be? How firm a number is that for Madeline?
She could be as low as 210 or as high as 222, if the standard error is 6.
And so?
Well, and so if in fact it was 222, she should have passed.
But it's not just one student whose scores are in doubt. In Massachusetts, there are thousands of students like Madeline Valera, students who scored within a few points of the cut.
What can you say about those students' scores?
Well, they are what they are.
How accurate are they?
They're accurate within the level of precision of the test.
Which means that they could be over the cut or under the cut.
That's right. That's right.
Test experts can calculate the number of students who failed when they should have passed. On the 10th grade math test alone, an estimated 3,000 students were misclassified.
The standard error of measure is absolutely a fact. That anytime you give a test, anytime you have a place, then you worry about that standard error and what would have happened on another day. My answer to that continues to remain that we are giving 4 opportunities to retake the test at a time when kids are growing anyway in their intellectual ability, and that someone who gets a 216, I would feel very confident would be able to score a 220 easily within the next 4 retakes.
I don't think ideally we should be setting up situations where we know kids are going to fail. I don't think that failure is a great motivator for most people.
Linda Nathan is principal at Madeline Valera's school, Boston Arts Academy.
If we think this is important, I think it should be part of a kid's high school record, but not the sole thing. So you can get A's, legitimate A's in high school, and not pass this test and be told, oh, don't worry, John, you still got 4 more chances. I don't know that I think that's a positive setup for kids.
Test experts like George Madaus agree that retakes are not the answer. He'd like to include grades and teacher recommendations, along with test scores, in decisions over graduation.
The technology has inherent limitations to it. You can get a measure, but there is error in it, and before you make a decision, you should do what a doctor would do. You get other measures of the same thing, put them together, and then come up with a clinical judgment about the kid, rather than just take the number and decide that you're going to do something or not do something.
I don't think they get the real me at all. I don't think a test can really tell you what you know.
Soon, Massachusetts will allow students who just miss passing to appeal their scores, using grades and other records to show they know enough to graduate. With safeguards in place, some experts say, there is room in our schools for high-stakes testing.
The measurement community is universal in its condemnation of a single criterion, like a single test score, to be used in making an important decision like denial of the diploma. But to use a test score as one contributor to a variety of evidence to make that decision, that's acceptable. I believe that properly constructed high-stakes tests, tests that can help teachers teach more effectively, should be used. I think the public has a right to know how well their schools are doing. So to resist any kind of testing, I think, is disadvantaging the children. You have to create the right kinds of tests, but they can be a powerful force for instructional design, for getting kids to learn what they ought to learn.
In the latest round of testing, MCAS scores improved dramatically, easing fears that great numbers of students would not graduate on time. But there are still questions in Massachusetts and other states about how much testing really tells us about what students are learning.
States have this notion that if they have standardized tests, they're there. And that's not the issue. It's not whether you have them or not, it's what's in them. And that second question is a much more difficult one to deal with, and yet we find states somewhat unwilling to really confront that reality.
William Schmidt teaches at Michigan State University.
The real issues have to do with what it is, the substance, the discipline. What are we expecting children to learn at those grade levels? Is it the kind of things that give them a chance in life to compete internationally? And I'm not talking about just on a test, but I mean for their jobs, for their futures. This is what's important, and this means we have to have a dialogue about what mathematics, what science, what literature, what history is important for kids to know at 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and then test those accordingly. We don't go there.
Back in Virginia, they are doing the hard work of deciding what all students should know. And in this state, with its rich and painful past, the hardest subject to decide may be history.
My question is, isn't Robert E. Lee's name essential to the event called the Civil War? I'm just speaking about the name Robert E. Lee.
Okay, well, we need to go back before we leave to clarify how we're going to deal with these names again. Because if you mention him and you say, well, is he essential? Then, of course, Abraham Lincoln's essential, Jefferson Davis essential, USS Grant's essential, Frederick Douglass essential, and you're going to get a long list of names again.
This committee is grappling with the difficult task of deciding which historic figures all Virginia students should study. But the process broke down over names, specifically who to include and who to omit.
One measure of our meeting the diversity charge will be the names in the document. And in fact, when I sat at the Fairfax public hearing, I heard public comment that was not favorable because there weren't enough names.
It is strongly recommended by our committee that the names stay in.
We do not have to put those names in the standards, not for 412.
In other words, you would want a document devoid of names completely? Mike?
I'm troubled because it seems almost a discussion that's been unfolding for 4 months, and we seem not to be able to come up with a win-win situation. I wish someone would have an epiphany at this table right now and come up with a win-win situation.
No one did. Arguments over names continued without resolution.
With regard to a policy statement, I admit that so far it appears to be a little ragged, but I don't want us to get hung up on that right now. So we'll just proceed with the other questions.
People feel, particularly about U.S. history, people feel very strongly, and they feel they know it. It is a very long process to get consensus about that which is regarded as essential understandings for K-12 students. It isn't obvious. The process requires reflection and deliberation, and it's a consensus that's hard fought, but once realized, I think will result in standards that are well received.
Any further comments?
While the committee struggled over historic figures, behind the scenes, groups of citizens were lobbying hard to add material to the state's history curriculum. Among the spectators at the meeting was Richard Kevorkian.
We would like to see the genocide included in the state SOLs. The Armenian genocide is important because it was the model. It was the first genocide in the 20th century, and so the Armenian genocide has, in a sense, given birth to other genocides.
Kevorkian, a painter and retired professor, is seen by some as a special interest. It's a term he does not refute.
If you don't engage in supporting the people from whom you came, who will?
Armenians were not the only ones seeking to add to the history schools would be required to teach.
People studying the history of Virginia in grades 3 and 4 might get the impression that African Americans had no history before 1619, the beginning of slavery.
Andrew Prophet, a high school history teacher, pushed the state to include a study of the ancient kingdom of Mali in the new history curriculum.
Mali is essential because it happened. The people of Mali were a part of the international trade of gold and salt. The people of Mali were a part of the spread of Islam and the exchange of scholars, the building of cities, and the exchange of knowledge.
The Kingdom of Mali has nothing to do with the beginning of this country. Nothing, absolutely nothing to do.
The proposal to add Mali provoked strong criticism from David Sachs, who's reviewed history standards in 48 states.
I think you're falling out of what's essential. So instead of looking at that, we look at Greece and Rome. And it's not that these are white people or the history of Europeans. This is the history of ideas, the history of religion, law, and the very things that make this a great nation, the United States.
I want all students to know that what we call progress or the lack of progress is shared by all people, and not any one particular people happen to have dropped out of the sky with slavery as their beginning around 1619 as a result of a Dutch man of war landing off the coast of Virginia. That's not history.
In the end, the committee decided to include Mali. The Armenian genocide was left out.
It's hard work to grapple with the fundamental issue of what's really important for all children to learn. We get hung up in the politics, and then we leave our kids out of the equation, and it's for them that we should be having this kind of serious dialogue.
Meanwhile, in Virginia's schools, the debate over standards comes down to test scores, and the latest results are back. In high-poverty districts like Richmond, most schools are still struggling. But for the rest of Virginia, there was reason to celebrate. The statewide pass rate doubled from nearly 20% to 40%. There was good news for Baker Elementary, and Verina High School passed the test too. But behind all the celebrations lie real concerns about the effect of mandatory testing on the quality of teaching and learning.
All right, now, tomorrow we have our 6 weeks test. Remember that the majority of the test is multiple choice. So I want to
Robin Farmer teaches algebra at Spotsylvania High School.
Most of the time in the past, I've always given problems where they showed their work, they got partial credit. I'm turning more and more into multiple choice type questions because that's the type of question that they're going to have to answer on the test. All right, the next thing I'm passing out is the SOL practice for the week. This is going to be due on Thursday. And, you know, we have to give the multiple choice questions because we have to train them how to take a multiple choice type test. So I end up doing things like, okay, guys, remember, you really don't need to know how to solve this problem. You can take all the answers and substitute them in. So one thing that I see that's happening is the kids, particularly the smarter kids, because I've got smarter kids, they know ways around this kind of thing. And instead of solving the problem, they'll take the answers one by one, plug them in, and see which one works. So they're manipulating. They really don't know that concept. They know how to substitute a number in. Remember I told you, when you take this test, they'll have a choice like this, they'll have a choice like this, but why is one better than the other?
When preparing for tests becomes the first priority, teachers say there's a price to pay.
What good does it do to have a kid do a project when he is not going to be tested on it?
Supplementary is associated with how many?
To teach the formula for calculating distances, math teacher Herbert Morris used to take students on field trips to the James River in Richmond. There, he'd present them with a real-life problem.
How far is it across this river? How can you calculate it? I'll give you a sextant or a compass and you can measure the angle. Do you know how to measure the width of this river without getting wet?
You don't have time to do that?
Not truly.
Isosceles? Oh, okay. Oh, man. You don't think I'm taking this test for you, do you? All right,
Today, instead of going to the river, Morris goes through math problems more likely to appear on the state test.
Thus it's interior. Got it?
Okay, you miss it. Would the kids learn more doing it that way?
They would learn so much more applying it, going out and getting dirty and doing it.
American students are going to be spending less time solving problems down by the river and more time taking tests with number 2 pencils. Congress has passed the president's plan to test all students in grades 3 through 8 in math and reading. But how far along are the 50 states in deciding what every student should learn and then building tests that truly measure what's taught?
It's a chaotic situation where none of that coherence exists, nothing lines up, and so you have a teacher being torn in so many different directions. Standard saying this, the textbook is so big and has so many things that they know they can't do it, but they try to do it. The tests are in another direction. That's not a professional environment.
And will the new law come with enough money? In a weakened economy, states might be tempted to go back to using cheap, ready-made tests.
If we have more of the same kinds of tests we're currently using, good things will not happen in American education. We have to create tests that really do reflect how well teachers have been teaching. Those kinds of tests will allow, I think, public education to survive. The kinds of tests that we're using now is setting up public educators for absolute failure.
You have 75 minutes. You may begin the test.
This report continues on our website, where you'll find a guide for parents with information on testing in your state, a report on the surprising politics behind the president's landmark education bill.
And you must show us whether or not every child is learning.
Read the extended interviews, plus links and background readings. And something new. Find out on our website if this program is re-airing on your station and when. Then join the discussion at PBS Online, pbs.org, or write an email to frontline@pbs.org, or write to this address.
Next time on Frontline. As the war between the Israelis and the Palestinians intensifies, Frontline goes behind the lines on both sides. How did a conflict once fought with stones escalate towards all-out war? Battle for the Holy Land. Next time on Frontline.
To obtain a VHS copy of Testing Our Schools, please call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
National corporate funding for Frontline is provided by Earthlink. And by NPR.